Matt, appreciate you taking the time, man, and congrats on the recent launch of Underdog Global Partners. Super excited to hear more about what you guys are building. But I want to start with the backstory. What was the initial spark behind launching this fund, and even more so, like, why did you think now was the right time to do so?
Thanks, Malcolm. By the way, it's a pleasure to be here. Congrats on everything you're doing. I'm a big fan of your work.
Thank you. Appreciate that, man.
And a birdie told me you might be moving from Miami up by me in Miami. So that make,
we,
it's good
we,
in
we-
my book.
we'll see what happens, but yeah, we're trying to put plays into motion for sure.
No, but just so real quick on background, my background originally, the first chapter of my career, I built a media and marketing agency called North Six Agency, N6A. Spent about 12 years building that business. We built a great business, and then I was looking at the world around me. This was right around the time of COVID, and as much as I loved the media and marketing industry, I really wanted to expand my horizons from an entrepreneurial standpoint, learn about new things. I was always passionate about sports. I was passionate about Italy. It's where my family immigrated from, and that's when I started to dabble into sports ownership. Bought a minority interest at the time in this club called Campobasso FC, a soccer team in Italy, which then quickly became a control stake. And we were really fortunate in that project. We were able to get the team promoted two times in 2 seasons. This was around the same time Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney were doing their thing at Wrexham. So we sort of became known as the Wrexham of Italy. Sold our TV show to Disney, Running with the Wolves, which just aired this past summer. So that was amazing. Joined some amazing, found some amazing partners along the way. Mark Consuelos, Kelly Ripa, they became co-owners in the club, and that was really my foray into sports ownership. And I started to build a nice network around sports. And then before I knew it, one asset became two assets, became three assets, and over the years we've collected this really incredible portfolio of sports assets. Typically, these underdog type assets that are in places in the world that are highly desirable, but for one reason or another, the assets, the teams might need a little bit of TLC. They're a little bit undervalued. And then through our network and our skill set with sales and marketing and media and our network here in North America, we're able to build incremental value and open up these clubs to new revenue channels and new fan exposure channels that might not necessarily have existed before. And I've been basically that's been my life the past 5 or 6 years is doing that. And Underdog Global Partners is kind of the culmination and the next chapter of and the natural continuation of what been doing. It's me sort of centralizing and professionalizing all of these assets into one operating entity called Underdog Global Partners. We have three subsidiaries. We have our sports subsidiary, which right now contains all of our sports franchise assets. We have a real estate subsidiary, which is going to be the subsidiary that captures all of the synergistic real estate. So working on some stadium projects, some arena developments, potential sports academy projects. All of those investments will live in the real estate subsidiary. And then the third subsidiary is media and IP. So any sort of media, sports related media investments, intellectual property, image rights, anything of that nature will live in that subsidiary. So I'm excited. I worked my butt off obviously the past 5 or 6 years to put ourselves, I think, in a position to really, we're very passionate about creating a new type of sports private equity, not just
Mhm.
built on exclusively on IRR and financial return, even though, of course, that's a big focus of ours, but it's about more than just that. And, it's about creating opportunities and experiences and access to new relationships and networks. And that's the beauty of sports investing, as I found, personally in my experience over the past 5 or 6 years. And UGP, Underdog Global Partners, is really the next chapter and the next wave and all that.
I love it, man. There's a lot to unpack there, but I really want to hone in on like the thesis behind Underdog. What was it like trying to lay that foundation and come up with a strategy that positions you all to have success as capital allocators into this asset class?
Well, I think the interesting thing for me, Malcolm, is when I first got into sports investing, private equity was just starting to really get acquisitive in terms of their particularly European football clubs. There was a lot of private equity money pouring into England, and Italy was just starting to come in. But the thing that I noticed at the time was that most of that capital was being allocated to acquire assets that were tier one, Premier League level or Serie A in the case of Italy level assets. And so I was seeing there was an interesting market developing for sports as an asset class, which it wasn't called sports as an asset class back then. Now sports is really considered its own asset class. But the market opportunity that I saw was these underdog type teams. The beauty of the European game is that it's built on, it's fully free market, open market, entrepreneurial. It's built on meritocracy. If you win, you can go up in levels. If you lose, you go down in levels. If you go up in levels, you make money. If you go down in levels, you lose money. So I really was enamored with the concept of identifying these underdog type assets that might, for one reason or another, be undervalued, but have a ton of upside potential. And whenever we looked at the deals, we always studied, you have to ask yourself, what is the downside risk? Your
Yeah.
mind has to go right to what is the worst case? What does the worst case look like? Because the upside and the best case, we all understand that and we can get comfortable with it. So my mind always went, and I was spending, this was my cash I was investing. It wasn't like I wasn't raising capital when we first did these deals. It was my money I was putting into these assets. So I said, what is my comfort level on a personal basis, a personal level with the risk? And if I could get comfortable with the risk, then the upside makes it worth it. And so I saw this kind of interesting opportunity developing. Now, 5 or 6 years later, you're seeing a lot of private equity firms allocate money into sports franchises and assets that are not just tier one assets. They're all over the map. But I think we were really early in the game, and obviously, I think I was at a little bit of an advantage because in the case of Italy, I knew Italian culture well. I spoke the language. I sort of grew up around the sport, and I was able to live my dream through my work, which has been an awesome experience, and I think the most gratifying out of the whole journey so far.
Really cool, really cool. And obviously, for people who might not realize, there are a lot of nuances between investing here in the States domestically and investing in Europe. Obviously, one of those things, and specifically in soccer, is the regular like the promotion and regulation aspect of it all. So, what are some of the other challenges that people might not understand about investing in assets in Europe as opposed to in America?
Well, I think the biggest mistake is a lot of foreign investors, not just in America, but all over the world. I think one of the mistakes they make is they don't focus on the local community aspect of the clubs. In the case of European teams, the biggest clubs and the most valuable clubs in the world, from Real Madrid to Liverpool to Man United, if you trace the history and the lineage of those clubs, it goes back to clubs that were founded, for the most part, for laborers and for the community. And the ethos and the DNA of those clubs has never really changed. It's changed in the sense that now they're mega multi-billion dollar commercial uh, assets. However, they're still very much rooted in the community, and I think that's the mistake a lot of these foreign ownership groups make, is that they first and foremost look at these assets as globally commercialized assets, and the reality is it's got to be an inside out approach. You have to go in my opinion, and really lean into the community aspect of it first, lean into the history, understand the heartbeat of these clubs is coming not from the international markets and from merchandising and from media. Those are all secondary benefits and secondary strategies to focus on. The primary focus needs to be, how do we embrace the community and have respect for the history of these assets, which is really built on the laborers and the workers and the community component. And in the case of our assets in Italy, like whenever I go to Italy to this day, I refuse to do any media interviews or press conferences in English. I really, even though it's not my first language, Italian, I feel like it's important to show a level of respect and
Yeah.
connection to the local fans and the local communities, and just little details like that. It's very hard to fake those things. You have to bring a level of authenticity to these operations, because at the end of the day, you're an ambassador for clubs that have been around for generations and will be around, frankly, for generations way after you leave them. And you have to remember that it was started as a community club first. And then once you nail that, then you can really focus on the international component of it.
I love it, man. I couldn't agree more. And speaking about Campobasso, what was the most surprising thing that you learned about team ownership when you first got into when you first invested in that team?
Well, you got to win on the field. That's the first thing I noticed. And I learned that real quick, especially I think as an American owner going into a foreign country. there's expectations, and luckily coming from New York, the sports culture here in New York, they don't really have a high tolerance for failure, for losing. So I was and I was on the fan side, obviously, for many years before I got into ownership. So I understood that, I respected that. But then when you get into Europe, the importance of winning is everything. And I think it's going to be hard for any other aspect of your sporting project to succeed in Europe if you don't commit to winning on the pitch or on the court or wherever it might be. And look, I think fans understand. They understand that winning is not a guarantee, but they at least want to see that you're 1000% committed to doing everything you can to put the team in a position to winning and to learning. In the case of Campobasso, we were fortunate. We won 2 championships in our first 2 years. It was the first time in the 105-year history of the club that happened. So I think we earned a lot of, I think, goodwill and credibility and political equity from the fans pretty early on, which then enabled us to do everything else. Once you have that kind of credibility, then you could have some fun internationally. You could start looking at what should the logo look like, and what should we play around with our merchandising strategy, and should we go talk to Disney about producing a docu-series on this amazing Cinderella project. But if you don't win on the pitch, those other things I think are going to come across as very transactional, and in some cases, I think the fans are going to see them as phony.
For sure, for sure. And you mentioned real estate being a big part of you guys' strategy. I'm a huge believer that, that's kind of the next frontier of sports, and how we'll see, physical assets being a huge valuation driver among other things. So what role do you see venues and districts and these physical assets kind of playing in the future of sports as an asset class?
I think it's everything, Malcolm. I think even if you look, turning the focus to domestic assets, if you look at the United States sports climate and look at like the big four leagues, NBA, NHL, MLB, it's been an incredible case study in the value of synergistic real estate on top of a sports franchise, a sports platform. And if you look at the multiples that come out of assets that are packaged as real estate, which is owned by the team, plus the IP of the sports component of it, they have accelerator multiples. Look at the Celtics versus the Lakers trade, which I think happened in the past 6 to 12 months. One franchise, I believe, Lakers own real estate, was valued at about 10 to 11 billion dollars, I think, if I recall. Celtics, not that it was a discount, but the Celtics traded, I think, at around 6 billion. The only difference is that one asset or one ownership group owned the stadium, the arena, and the other didn't fully own it.
That's
So I
true.
think that tells you everything you need to know. I think that sports in a silo is a sports asset in a silo is an incredibly valuable asset. Real estate in a silo can be an incredibly valuable asset, of course, but together it has an amplifier effect that I think becomes magical when you talk about multiples, and you talk about valuations, and you talk about scarcity.
Absolutely. And then on the media and IP side, like what is kind of piquing your interest there? Where do you see the most upside and opportunity?
I think image rights is very interesting. If you look at what some of the private equity firms, Redbird is getting very acquisitive in terms of starting their own dedicated practice areas for image rights, the rights to own IP to celebrities, athletes, entertainers. Obviously, when you look at Authentic Brands Group, what they've done, I think they bought up and they've become, I think, the largest, if not the largest, one of the largest stakeholders in tier one celebrity image rights. And I think that that's very interesting as you talk about operating sports assets. Sports assets are more than buying a franchise or buying a team. It's about buying it's an ecosystem of synergistic assets that combined create a ton of value. And in that is, teams, real estate, IP, image rights, and now data and analytics is becoming interesting. Sports broadcast rights are super interesting as well. So I think I kind of look at IP, image rights, I think, as one incredibly important spoke in a much larger wheel, particularly of what we're building here at UGP, a larger wheel and ecosystem of sports related assets that all kind of talk to each other. We want our assets to talk to each other. So we want, from a synergy standpoint, we want our sports franchises to talk to our sports media assets, to talk to our sports real estate assets in a way where the sum of the parts outseeds, the whole.
For sure. And obviously like each of the I guess subsidiaries that you operate in or the opportunities that you're looking at may have a different criteria, but like when you're analyzing a deal or opportunity, what are some of the key things that you look for, pay attention to see like this is viable, this is something that we will be potentially interested in?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, the first thing I look at when we're at UGP, something that we'll look at when we analyze deals is you got to go to the downside first. What is the risk of this deal? Because the upside is easy. When you're buying I'm just random examples. When you're buying the New York Yankees, or you're thinking about buying the Boston Red Sox, or you're thinking about buying the New Jersey Devils, it's easy to fall in love with the upside. Everyone understands what the upside, and to paint a really pretty picture of what life would look like as the owner of the New York Yankees or the New Jersey Devils or the San Francisco 49ers or whatever it would be. The hard part is, what does the downside look like? What does the rainy day scenario here looks
Yeah.
like? Where could life become very challenging and very difficult and very risky if we get into this deal? And if you can get comfortable with that, I think that sort of, at least in our case, has always been our compass on whether or not that deal passes muster, at least to the point where it's worth getting into diligence and it's worth getting into the negotiation phase. So that's the first kind of guiding principle when we look at deals, Malcolm, is what does the worst case look like? And if we can get comfortable with the worst case, then at least, we check that box and move on to the next step. I think another thing we'll look at is scarcity. There's only so much beachfront property. That's the reality. There's a reason why real estate, homes on the water, trade at a higher multiple than homes that are not on the water. There's only so many homes that are waterfront homes, and that you
Yep.
can't really build more waterfront property for the most part. And I think the same thing is very true of sports assets. So when we analyze a lot of these deals, we say, is this an asset that can't really be recreated? And some of the assets we bought, I think, are proof of that. We went in when we got involved in European basketball, we bought Napoli basketball. And one of the big reasons we did that is because, Naples is a massive international brand. And we own the basketball team in one of the most important international cities in the world, with one
Mhm.
of the most important fan bases and passionate fan bases that lives in the biggest cities across the world. I mean, it means something. And I think you can't go out and recreate Napoli. You can't recreate Rome. You can't recreate Barcelona. You can't recreate, some of these, New York or Miami. So I think that we look at the scarcity component of it too and ask ourselves, is this an asset that is uniquely scarce? Is it something that can't be recreated? So that's another thing. And then I think also you have to look, most importantly, maybe, you have to look 5, 10, 20 years out, and you have to ask yourself, what is the world around us going to look like, from, in this case, from a sports investment standpoint, 20 years from now? These are generational assets. If you're looking to buy and flip sports assets, it's a very, it's a very risky play. It's like trying to guess the weather. I mean, the
Yeah.
asset values, kind of fluctuate like the weather. So you have to really ask yourself, you have to have a, long-term 5, 10, 20-year view and say, what is the world around me going to look like? And does this particular asset fit into that broader macro climate of sports investments? And I think those are the three things that we'll generally look at. What's the downside risk? Is this an asset that can be recreated or not? And is this an asset that easily sort of slides into our vision of what, and our view of what the sports investment world is going to look like 10, 20 years out, when you're talking about the next generation of sports fans?
Yeah, that's amazing insight. I really appreciate that. And obviously, we're seeing a lot of activity and interest around women's sports and even youth sports as well. I don't know how much that is happening maybe in Europe or certain parts of Europe, but do you guys see that becoming a part of the mandate or something that is going to be of interest for you guys when you're looking at opportunities?
Absolutely, without a doubt, Malcolm. I am, excuse me, I'm extremely bullish on women's sports in general. I think that's one of the areas that, certainly as a group here at UGP, we're going to continue to be really acquisitive about. It's also cool, I saw it firsthand. It's amazing. You got to remember, in sports, it is a privilege. It really is a privilege to work in this. I mean, I get dozens and dozens and dozens of resumes every day from people who are at all phases of their career, and they all want to work in sports. Everybody wants to work in sports. And I think that you have to remember it's a privilege to work here. Like it's a privilege to be in the sports game as a profession. And in terms of women's sports, the cool thing about it is that you're at the ground level still, because you're still very much, I think women's sports is still very much in its infancy. It certainly has
Yeah.
been validated, no doubt, as it should have been. It's been validated as a viable, long-term, sustainable asset that is not going anywhere, but it's still very much in its infancy. So you have to remember when you're talking about women's sports, I think one of the reasons it's so unique and so cool for us is you're creating the next generation of mega franchises, mega sports assets. So like think about creating like the New York Yankees were founded in 1903. Dallas Cowboys were founded, I don't know when, you might know better than I, 1930s, 1940s, whenever it was. But like when you're investing in women's sports in 2025 or 2026, you're investing in the next generation of the Dallas Cowboys, the next generation of the New York Yankees, the next generation of the Los Angeles Lakers. And that's cool. Like you're bringing those assets and those franchises, you're breathing them to life. And that to me is such an exciting thing to be a part of. And it really, for me, it's invigorating. And, when we look at our women's sports assets, we were the first group to buy a professional independent women's team in the city of Rome, which is a massive brand. We rebranded it as Donnarumma. Like you have to look 20 years out and say, what is this women's sports ecosystem and environment and macro environment going to look like? And we think an asset like that is going to be the next generation and the reference point that people look and say, they're going to say, wow, like, Donnarumma is one of the most incredible assets in the women's sports ecosystem. And there's so many of those opportunities now. And that's cool. Like you can create those things from scratch. It also creates an incredible responsibility for you from a social perspective as an owner, because you're bringing to life the next generation of these women's sports franchises. And what that does is it breeds an incredible amount of responsibility on you to make sure that the social component of it is something that you prioritize above everything else. You're giving opportunities to new fan bases and to female athletes and coaches that didn't exist before. And that's an incredible responsibility as well.
Absolutely, man. I love that outlook, and I'm glad you talked about the privilege, man, because I try to keep that top of mind almost daily, and I think it's super important to pay it forward. So with that in mind, like if there was someone listening who was interested in sports, investing or wanted to get into this space in some capacity, what advice would you give them on how to navigate this industry, this up and coming ecosystem?
Well, I would say spend the first year, at least 1 year, learning. A lot of investors in sports, I think, bite off more than they can chew, where they get in and they say, oh, I want to be the next owner of this soccer team, basketball team, whatever the sport may be. And they don't really understand the amount of work that and expertise, frankly, that is required to do that. And it's not the kind of thing that's easy to unwind. It's like once you invest and once you make that decision, it's hard to unwind from that decision. So I think a gradual build where you start as a minority owner and you look back and you kind of learn and build a network and make mistakes, or at least see what mistakes other people are making. And then you sort of gradually build into a position where you, over time, if that's what your goal is, you take a control stake. I think that's a more pragmatic and practical and intelligent way to enter the world of sports investing. I think the biggest mistakes I've seen sports investors make, they let their egos get in the way, where they just think that because they made a ton of money in technology or they made a ton of money in finance or whatever it might be, they can go in and own a team and they're going to win all their games and the team's going to make a ton of money. And it doesn't work. 99% of the time it doesn't work that way. So you really need to, I think, be smart about backing the right operators, being wise in terms of, and being selective in terms of who you're betting on. And then in time, as your network grows and as your knowledge base grows, when you step into that control seat, you've already given yourself the chance to make the mistakes and to sort of learn before you do that. Learning on the job in this business when you're in a control position is a very risky proposition. Learning on the job when you're in a minority position, I think, is a much smarter way to go about doing it.
For sure, for sure. As we wind down, man, and last couple questions, looking maybe 5, 10 years from now, what would you say what would you call success for Underdog Global Partners? What does that look like for you guys?
Well, I think obviously when you talk about building, we're really trying to build the future of sports private equity, and it's built on franchises, it's built on sports real estate, and it's built on sports media. And I think if we can write sort of an innovative new page in the private equity playbook and sort of re-educate or educate in some cases from scratch people to get them to think differently about what private equity returns are really defined upon. I think that would be success to me, and I'm sort of living proof of it. When I got into sports ownership, I put a lot of my own cash into this. I didn't go out and raise money at first. It was my money. I took a lot of the risk myself. And I look back on it now, and when you look at the return profile, you can't just evaluate the return profile based on your financial return and based on your IRR or traditional private equity metrics. It's really a 360-degree evaluation of return. I've also met amazing people and walked into relationships, nurtured relationships that I never in a million years would have thought I would have had the opportunity to be a part of. I've experienced things with loved ones, with friends, with family that as a result of my sports investing that I would have never in a million years dreamed of experiencing. I've had access to deals, deal flow that I've actually, made a lot of money in other deals because of opportunities that were sourced as a result of the ecosystem we've built through sports. So I think that the most important thing, and it's something that I take very seriously over the next 3 to 5 years, I'd like to educate people out there about when you think about what is return on investment, what does that really mean? It doesn't just mean I put $1 in and I got $3 out. It means I put $1 in and my whole life has changed. Obviously there's a financial return component to that too, which is paramount. But in addition to that, it's more than, if you're just looking, I'm looking to put $1 in and get $1 X, three out or $1 X five or 10 out. There's other places to put your money, park your money elsewhere and you can kind of sit back and 5 years from now, your dollar comes back and it's worth $10 or whatever it should be. In the world of sports investing, I think the ROI profile is much more layered. And frankly, I think it's much more beautiful. I think it's the unpredictable nature of sports is what attracts so many people to it. It's unpredictably positive from an upside standpoint, and it's also unpredictably risky from a downside standpoint. And you have to sort of understand those risks and be comfortable with it. And I think that's what makes the journey beautiful. Like in the case of Campobasso, our soccer team, that club has returned, the valuation of that club has, at least 10x versus, today where it was when we first bought into it 4 years ago. And it could easily have went down 10x, by the way. So, we got, a lot of that is kind of luck and good operating skills and all that, but it could have easily went south as much as it went north. And I think that's also the beauty of this sports investment journey is that the the sports investment experience or sports investing experience, I think, is just as unpredictable and unscripted as the nature of sports itself. The
Yeah.
games. You turn on the Heat game, or down in Florida, you turn on the Heat game or the Dolphins game. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. Although this year with the Dolphins, you might know what the
You
outcome is
might
going to
know.
be. But and I think that's the same is true on the investment side of sports. And you need people who kind of like that and are motivated by that.
Matt, man, this has been incredible. I love your perspective, love your insight. Super impressed with what you built and what you are building. Last but not least, can you let people know where they can learn more about Underdog and also connect with you?
Yeah, for sure. Check us out, www.underdoggp.com. That's our website. Instagram at Underdog Global Partners. And I just want to say, Malcolm, thanks for the time. For me, I'm living proof. I think this has been a really incredible experience for me over the past 5 or 6 years. I never in a million years dreamed that I would be building what we believe is the next generation of a sports private equity firm. But we're here now. We're going all in on it. I'm kind of looking at this next chapter where we're really doubling down on the network and the relationships and the knowledge base that we've built over the past 5 or 6 years, and we're certainly gonna go all in and go for it, or die trying. That's the game plan here. And if nothing else, if we can kind of get people to rethink their their valuation of what ROI means when it comes to sports investing, and I'm living proof of it, I think we've done a pretty decent job.
My man, Matt, appreciate it. Looking forward to seeing your continued success.
Thanks, Malcolm. Appreciate the time.